All right, so I just want to back up a little bit because I want to actually show you how we actually calculate GDP. Now, what we have here is we have something called nominal GDP and real GDP. So right now, what we're calculating is nominal GDP, and nominal GDP in some textbooks will be called current dollar GDP, or they'll call it money GDP. So I'm just going to give you an example of how we figured out all these numbers. Consumption, 536 billion. Government purchases, 191 billion. So I'm just going to show you how we actually get those numbers. How do we actually calculate GDP? And we're going to use something here once again. GDP is the definition where we're looking at the total value of all final goods and services produced over a given year, valued at current prices. So I just want to show you what exactly that means. All right, so let's say we're here to calculate GDP for 2019, and we're going to say we're going to calculate Canada's GDP or nominal GDP or money GDP. So Canada's nominal GDP, GDP for 2019. Okay, and this is gonna be a very simple calculation. So let's say Canada in 2019 only produced three things. So let's say they produced wheat, and they produced, actually, I'm gonna back up here. And I'm just going to tell you that to calculate nominal GDP, so nom GDP, I abbreviate it as NGDP. So NGDP, the formula is the summation of current output, so that is Q current, times P current, so price current. Okay. So, so this is the formula to calculate nominal GDP. So now I am going to do an example of what exactly this means. All right, so let's say in 2019, Canada's nom GDP of 2019. So that's what we're going to try and calculate. And let's say that we are going to, that Canada only produces three things. So we have wheat, maple syrup, I'm being really Canadian here, and salmon. Okay, so we're gonna need two things. We're gonna need output and price. So how much did Canada produce? How much was the current price? And I'm gonna go price times Q. Okay. So let's say that we produce 1,000 tons of wheat. And let's say the price is $100 per ton. So that means that price times quantity is equal to 100,000, right? Now let's say in 2019, Canada produced 50 gallons of maple syrup. And let's say a gallon of maple syrup is $50. So therefore, how much was the value of maple syrup in 2019? So in this case, it is $2,500. And lastly, let's say we produce 2,000 units of salmon, and let's say it's valued at $20. So what is the value currently of salmon in 2019? So that is 40,000. All right, so now what we have done is we have calculated the value of these three goods. And now the last thing we need to do is do that summation part. And the summation part just basically means that we add them all up. So that means Canada's GDP, nominal GDP, so that is current output valued at current dollars, is equal to 142,500. So that is how we calculate nominal or current dollar GDP. All right, so now just a little bit of a quick note here where we talk about GDP and double counting. So I already mentioned this issue, is that GDP only calculates the value of all final goods and services. So any intermediate goods are goods that is used in the production that actually gets transformed into a final good before it is sold for final consumption. So we do not add in intermediate goods. All right, so now moving on to nominal GDP and real GDP. So remember, we use GDP in different calculations in terms of business and economic health. Nominal GDP is often used when we're looking at the size of different economies. So when we say, you know, the US is the largest economy in the world, it's the largest economy in the world because we calculate the GDP in current dollars. And when we look at the US GDP and we compare that to China's GDP, we can say that China's GDP is, you know, the value of it is one below the US. So therefore, the second largest economy in the world is China. However, we do use a different type of GDP, and we use this, and this is probably one of the most important measures of GDP, and it is there to measure economic growth or economic regression. So anytime there's an economic regression, that means that GDP is going negative, and that usually happens when the economy is slowing down. So that means that an example is that in 2019, Canada's economy increased, say, 3%. But let's say in 2020, because we're going through a recession because of the COVID-19, that Canada's GDP actually didn't grow, but actually contracted, which means that it actually went negative by 2%. So whenever we're there to measure a change in economic activity, we do not use nominal GDP. We use another figure called real GDP. So I'll give you an example why we use real GDP and why we don't use nominal GDP. All right, so here is our real GDP and our nominal GDP. So let's just go through why we use our real GDP versus our nominal GDP in measuring economic growth. Okay, so let's take a look at our GDP formula. So if we look at our nominal GDP, so our nominal GDP, and let's use 2018, okay? So our nominal GDP is made up of everything that we produced in 2018 times by the prices of 2018. So we have output of 2018 times prices of 2018. And then if we were going to compare economic growth, that means we're going to compare that to nominal GDP of 2019, which is the same formula. So it is the aggregate of everything that we produce in 2019 times the prices of 2019. So if I were to come up with this statement and say that the economy has increased or GDP has increased from 2018 to 2019, so let's make that statement. So Canada's nominal GDP increased 6% from 2018 to 2019. So if you look at this statement, and you got to remember, GDP is there to measure output. Next week, when we talk about CPI or the GDP deflator, we are there to measure changes in price level. So one measure, so the measure of GDP is there to measure output, not prices, but output. So if you take a look at this equation, and if we were to use nominal GDP, and we say that Canada's nominal GDP increased 6% from 2018 to 2019, and remember that this statement, we are saying that output has increased 6%. But if you look at this equation a little bit more carefully, you're noticing that nominal GDP is influenced by two things. Nominal GDP is influenced by output, and it is right now being influenced by price level. So therefore, an increase in 6%, which is really there to measure an increase in output, is really giving you a distorted measure of 6%, because this increase in 6%, is that coming from a change in output, or is that coming from a change in price level? So right now, this 6% is ambiguous. You don't know if output has changed, has it increased or has it decreased, or has this increase in 6% coming from prices. Now, once again, we don't know, has price level increased or decreased? So this is why whenever you measure economic growth, we do not use nominal GDP, but we use real GDP. So let me show you what that means. So I'm going to erase this statement, and I'm going to show you what real GDP means. So I'm going to erase that as well. Okay. And I'm going to now write out an equation for real GDP of 2019. So real GDP of 2019. So if you look in your notes here, As soon as we talk about real GDP, we're going to be using something called a base year. So a base year is a year where we keep prices constant. So with real GDP, whenever we talk about real GDP, you're gonna use a base year. So so anytime you're calculating real GDP, you will need a base year, or else you're not going to be able to figure out the calculation. So we're going to look at figuring out 2019 and using 2018 as the base year. Whoops, not 2180, but 2018 is our base year. So how do we calculate our base year? What we're going to do is we are going to do pretty much the same thing. So we're going to add up the total value of output in 2019. So here is the little trick here. We're going to use 2019 as our output, but we are now going to use 2018 for our prices. So when you compare 2018, here I'm going to erase this. If we're going to get rid of our 2019 nominal GDP, and now if we were to make that statement again that Canada's GDP or Canada's real GDP has increased 6% from 2018 to 2019, now we can actually conclude that the increase of 6% has come only from output, and there has been no price influence. So you can see here, if we are comparing our GDP of 2018 and our real GDP of 2019, the price level is constant. So that means that the only change in this measurement is really only measuring a change in output. And that is what GDP should be measuring, a change in output with no influences on price. All right, so I hope that was a relatively clear example of how we calculate real GDP. So remember, real GDP, here is a quick example, is a summation of current output and base year prices. So usually whenever you're comparing 2 years, base year is always generally the year before. Okay, so when we're looking at what is the increase in output from 2017 to 2018, we're usually going to use 2017 as the base year. So I have an example here that we can work out. So hopefully it will make a little bit more sense. So we have, I'm asking you to calculate your real GDP for 2003. And once again, our 2002 is our base year. So let's calculate our 2003. Let's see our 2003 real GDP here. So let me just